I'm sure you already know that Father also is a proud member of the class of 1990. You can see that we're men of caliber. I hope the lighting's all right. I asked for it to be slightly subdued because I look better in subdued lighting. Now, I just want to clear up a few things before we start. Firstly, I arrived here at the weekend and I've just had the nicest time being here. But I'm slightly concerned about one thing because on Sunday I was asked to celebrate Mass in Latin. Today I was asked to celebrate Mass in Spanish. And I'm starting to worry that you don't understand the way I speak. If that's the problem, just put your hand up and cry help. And help will be given at that point. What I'm proposing today for our time together really is a symphony of 4 movements. And it will go something like this. We're going to have an introductory session now where we're going to look at some of the principles which really inform the situation where we find ourselves at the present time. So how did the translation that we've used since 1973 come to be made? Then we're going to have 2 sessions at which we're going to look at the texts, particularly the texts of the order of Mass. We're going to look at things that have changed, things that remain the same. We'll have an opportunity to sort of dialogue about that, and I'll be interested to hear your observations in relation to that. And then in the 4th and final session, I thought, and the plan sometimes changed, this sort of recipe tends to get ingredients added or subtracted as the day goes on. But my present intention is that we should, in the 4th session, look at 2 aspects of the implementation of the new texts. And we're going to look at them from the point of view of music and from the point of view of catechesis. If you're currently a deacon, some 4 or 5 months after your ordination, you will be using the new translations. The early years of your priesthood will be concerned with the implementation of this translation. If you're more than a year away from ordination to the priesthood, this will be the translation that you use during your ministry. And all of us, if we're involved in the catechetical, the liturgical endeavor of the church, will be focusing all our efforts, all our attention on this new translation. Now, Father said that I'm going to give you a PowerPoint presentation. It's even more high-tech than that. What we're going to use today for part of the time, and I shall use to illustrate some of the points so you just don't have to look at me and listen to me all the time, is an interactive DVD resource which ISIL has produced called Become One Body, One Spirit in Christ. And it will be the most comprehensive catechetical resource available, I imagine, for some time. It has 6 hours of video films in it, which are indexed so that you can use them for your own catechesis. It has a large amount of documentary material, 5 foundational essays which have been written by major theologians to guide our thought and our work in this regard. This resource is being released in the United States and indeed in Australia this Thursday. You are the first seminary in the world to see and use this resource, and I'm leaving copies with your faculty tomorrow when I go. So you'll be able to get your copy on Thursday if you order one. It's only going to be $15, so it won't break the bank, and it'll probably be the most useful catechetical tool that you acquire in the coming days. Now, just like all good symphonies, we have to have a prelude, I think, to begin all of this. So let's have something that sort of sets the mood.
In every age, since the Last Supper of Jesus Christ and his disciples, in every place, in every time, in every language, amongst all peoples and cultures, in joy and in grief, in peace and in war, in celebration and commemoration, with bread and wine, in faith and in hope, in believing communities, large and small, from country parish to city cathedral. The Eucharist, the Mass, continues to be celebrated by the Catholic community. In our place and in our time, Mass celebrated in the English language will be with the new English translation of the Roman Missal.
Just when you were thinking that a British accent was really bad, you hadn't taken account of an Australian accent. This resource is made by a wonderful ministry, I think they describe it, of the Sisters of Mercy in Australia called Framework. And they're a multimedia company who concentrate on catechetical media. And I hope that you'll feel by the end of today that they've produced something that's worth having. So, as I said, we, in considering receiving the translation of the Missal, the new translation, we have to begin by considering where we've come from, where it is, how we find ourselves in this situation.
The Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy was the first document approved by the Second Vatican Council, and it mandated a reform of the rite of Mass and the other rites, principally to facilitate greater active participation on the part of the people. It also gave permission for the celebration of the liturgy in the vernacular. Lots of experiments were made in the 60s. And then towards the end of the 60s, from Rome there came a document. It had a French title from its opening words. The words are "comme le prévoit." And this document gave guidance about how to translate the liturgy. "Comme le prévoit" was the result of linguistic reflection, and particularly from one man. His name was Eugene Nida. Nida worked for the American Biblical Association, and his concern was the production of translations of the scriptures into many languages so that the scriptures would become more widely known throughout the world. Nida was a very fine scholar indeed, and he was right up to date with the latest scholarship. And he developed this idea which he called dynamic equivalence. He said, when you translate a text, you don't have to be following the word order and the structures of the original text. What you have to be aiming to do is to have the same effect on the reader of your translation that the original text had on its original reader.
That really is the means by which we are able to express today thoughts and concepts which are central to the liturgy in the same way that they would have been received when the liturgical texts were first written or in the earliest time of their use.
People who were reflecting on liturgical language saw a very well-developed theory, and translators of the liturgy began to speak around about 1970 about dynamic equivalence.
The other voice, apart from myself speaking there, was my predecessor, Msgr Bruce Harbert, who, as you can see, in the course of his time at ISAL, lost all his hair. I had a full head of hair 18 months ago, so it must be something of an ongoing problem. What Msgr Harbert explained, really, was the theory that informs the translation that we currently use, which is generally regarded as dynamic equivalence. It basically gives us a translation which uses a register or category of language that is essentially that of everyday transactions, not very much elevated from the ordinary language that we use all of the time. One of the observations that ISEL has received, and there have been 3 major surveys of the 11 Episcopal conferences that make up ISEL in the years since 1973, one of the things that was a recurrent theme in the responses, things that people tended to observe, was that they would like rather more formal structures of language in the prayer. Father made reference to a sacral or sacral style of language, a style of language that perhaps is more fitted to worship and makes a differentiation from the type of language that we use on an everyday basis. This has been one of the considerations, one of various considerations that have been taken into account in the production of a new translation. All of the translations of the liturgy that we currently used have been made in accordance with Comme le Prévoir. So the register of the language is all the same as the Missal, more or less. The new translation of the Roman Missal, which we're about to have, will be the first translation that's made in accordance with different criteria. Perhaps we can consider what some of those are.
There was a difference between what Nida was doing and what a liturgical translator must do. Because Dr. Nida was translating biblical texts, so many of which are narrative. Liturgical translators translate prayers. They're not concerned to narrate and transmit facts. They're concerned to persuade God, and that's a very different use of language.
Now, the liturgy is an address to God. It does remind God of what he's done, but it needs to go further to ask God to do something else. It's, we might say crudely, an attempt to persuade God. Theorists of language tell us that we say things with words and we do things with words. By say things, I mean that we convey facts, information. But when I say we do things with words, I mean that we try to persuade people. And if you look at that document, Comme le Prévoir, it does look as if the compilers of it were thinking of the liturgy as a text that's addressed by the celebrant to the congregation. But it isn't. The liturgy is an attempt to persuade God to do what we want him to do. There was a misapplication then of Nida's theories, and he himself expressed regret about it. He said in his later writings that his teaching had been misunderstood and misused. In particular, he disliked the way people tended to say dynamic is good, formal is bad. And in fact, he dropped the term dynamic equivalence in his last writings, and he used the term functional equivalence. The translation is supposed to have the same function, the same effect. That's the important thing for him.
Some people will tell you that the translation of the liturgy that was used from the early 1970s until early in the 21st century was dynamically equivalent, and then it was replaced by a translation that's more formally equivalent. I want to say that that's not true, because early liturgical Latin was intended to have on its users the effect of creating an atmosphere of sacredness, a sense of high style. It was intended to impress the people who heard it. The translation that's coming into use now aims at a somewhat elevated and sacral style, and it will have an effect on those who hear it, more like the effect that Christian Latin had way back in the 5th century on the people who first heard those ancient texts. Sometimes formal equivalence is the way to dynamic equivalence,
People speak of formal and dynamic equivalents as if they were two wholly separate worlds. East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. That's never true, in fact. So it's not a choice of dynamic equivalence on the one hand or formal equivalence. It is a question, rather, of finding the proper convergence of formal and dynamic equivalence in a way that passes on as much as possible of the riches of the original.
Perfect praise. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord.
Amen. So I think you've got the general idea now that the present translation is characterized by a certain immediacy, a certain register of language that is that we use all of the time, and that comes to us with advantages. But the disadvantages are that not all of the elements of the content of meaning of the original are expressed in the translation, and we don't have this more sacral style that we perhaps feel is more easily suited to our worship. I hope at this stage, already in your mind, there are several ideas arising. The first is that our experience of vernacular liturgy is still new. We only have 40 years' experience of liturgy in the vernacular. And what we're addressing, at least in English, is a revision of what was our first attempt. Most other languages have already been through one revision. Why hasn't it happened in England, in English before? Well, I think there are a number of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is that the Church's own thinking in relation to this has been evolving and has only been codified in relation to a slightly different approach to translation relatively recently.
Back in the 60s and the early 70s, when the new Latin Missal was produced, there was a rush to get that text actually out amongst people.
Also, the people got new translations. They weren't really introduced to the change that took place in Vatican II as regards liturgy.
Almost immediately, it was recognised that those texts, which are the texts that we have grown up with, were in need of revision.
It has a number of omissions, and some parts of it are not terribly uplifting. It needs a more prayerful, poetic sound to it.
We've become familiar with phrasing which often obscures a theological richness.
With that first generation of translations, the intention was to keep the language simple and accessible, which is fine, although the problem can be that at times that becomes a sort of trivialisation. The Catholic Church had no experience of Englishing the Roman Rite, so the Anglican Church did. But for us, this was something new. So it's not surprising that the first attempt that we made immediately after the Council wasn't necessarily our best or final attempt.
A lot of discussion was going on about liturgical translation in the 80s and 90s. And ICEL conducted a survey asking people what sort of liturgical language they wanted. One thing was very clear from that international survey: people wanted a more formal language than we find in the current translation.
The language of the present translations is of a more everyday character. Some circumstances are more naturally formal in their character, and so demand from us a mode of expression that reflects that formality.
The first translators of the liturgy after 1970, particularly those involved with ICEL, for which I work, they themselves knew that their work would need to be revised. They knew that they were at the beginning of a learning process. So the revision process that's taken place, which has taken many years, has actually been in accord with the wishes of the first translators who produced the translation of the Mass that we use today.
So that gives you a rough outline of where we are and where things are going. I think it's probably good at this point for me to say a few words actually about the process itself. I discovered yesterday in speaking in a Latin class that very few people actually knew anything about ICEL. You know, what is it? Is it a group of people who sit in a dark room in DC and sort of make translations which they foist on the rest of the world? Or what is it? Well, you might be surprised to know that ICEL is an Episcopal Commission of 11 bishops, representing the 11 bishops' conferences of the United States, Canada, England and Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, India, Pakistan, and South Africa. Each of those conferences send a bishop to sit on the commission. And those bishops are not just, coming for a nice trip to DC and a few nice meals in Washington. They are actually translators. They are working on the translation. So they are men who are chosen specifically for the theological and linguistic gifts that they have that enable them to engage in this work. A translation is produced by a single base translator who produces a draft translation that's then worked on by a small committee of 4 bishops who have technical assistance in looking at that text. When they've worked on the text, it goes to the 11 bishops of the commission. After they've worked on the text, they take it back to their 11 bishops' conferences and present that text as what we call a green book. It's called green because that's the color of the cover of the book. And this is the first draft. And the bishops' conferences can examine the text themselves, and they can, at that point, consult as widely as they choose to. So that means they can ask anybody. They can send it to whoever they wish. They can invite comment from scholars, from people in the parishes, from priests in their diocese. There's been a lot of talk about consultation in relation to this. My experience is that when people say there hasn't been wide enough consultation, what they often mean is, nobody asked me. I haven't been involved in the process. But it's been up to the bishops' conferences to consult as widely as they choose to do. After that, the observations of 11 bishops' conferences come back to my office in DC, and together with my staff, we try and implement as much of the observations and suggestions as we can. Bearing in mind, there are over 700 bishops involved in the 11 conferences. That's a lot of material, and it all has to be very carefully sifted. The result of those amendments to the text are another book called the Grey Book. Once again, the colour of the cover. And the Grey Book goes back to the bishops' conferences, and they examine this, and they have to vote on the text. And when they've come to an agreement, that Grey Book is what they, as a conference, submit to the congregation for divine worship and the discipline of the sacraments, because the last stage of the process lies with them. And they can amend the text even radically in the very last stage of its production. So where are we up to now in relation to that process? Well, the Congregation for Divine Worship has issued what's called the recognitio, or the recognition of the final version of the Missal, and the conferences have just received a few weeks ago the 27 electronic files that make up the Missal. And we are working now with the conferences to put that text into a version that can be given to publishers. It has to be sorted out in terms of copy editing, punctuation, capitalization that's consistent, that all of the appearances of the same prayers in the Missal are consistent one with another. So when there are 6 appearances of the same prayer over the offerings in Advent, that they're all exactly the same and not 6 different versions of the same prayer. That's a very, very painstaking work and has to be done very carefully so that conferences can confidently give a text to their publishers that will be the same for each of the conferences throughout the world. The Holy Father has been very insistent, and this has been to the surprise of some, I would say, that at this time we should have one English version for the whole world. Now, you'll be sitting there thinking, yeah, you say tomato, I say tomato. how does all of that work when we all speak different versions of English? Well, we're about to discover how it works. I think the fact that it is a sacral register of language that is not our everyday English, even in Great Britain. However posh you are, nobody speaks in the way that the Missal speaks. So for all of us, it will be the acquisition and the use of a language that is other than the language we use in everyday transactions. Now, that presents challenges, viewed from a positive point of view, and difficulties, viewed from a less positive point of view. What are the challenges? Well, I think one of the challenges is that the new translation rehabilitates theological vocabulary. So in our catechesis, there will be things that we have to explain. You probably know what they are already. And with your spirit, consubstantial. The theological idea of merit, the oblation that we offer in offering the sacrifice. These are words that perhaps have very little significance for many of our people at the present time. But it's not a long and arduous task to help explore the meaning of those words. And by doing so, we have had an opportunity to penetrate more deeply into the mind of the Missal and the rationale behind the mystery that we celebrate when we celebrate the Eucharist. So I would suggest to you, and that's something we can speak about in the fourth session on catechesis, that the acquisition or the rehabilitation of theological vocabulary in the prayers of the liturgy is a great opportunity for us to bring about a greater understanding of the liturgy. I'd like to just concentrate very briefly before we have a moment for questions at the end of this session on the principles that really inform the new translation. For us as Catholics of the Roman Rite, our unity is expressed in the liturgical texts that we all use, even if they are then used in liturgical celebrations of different characters.
The new translation will form people in a deeper appreciation of what they are actually participating in when they come to a celebration of the Mass. So words are very important because they convey truth, they convey beauty, and they will convey something of the grandeur, the magnanimity, the greatness of God.
And they're words that are given to us as a gift. That's the other thing. They're not just our words. They're words that have been given to us as a gift. And that's one of the many reasons why I think we should treat the words of the Missal with great reverence.
The language in which the prayers of the Church are written is Latin. And in that way we preserve this sacred language and we ensure a continuity of translation.
It is the textual unity of the Roman Rite that gives us a sense of identity as members of the Roman Rite. So whereas the style of our celebrations may differ, we all use the same texts.
There's a maxim that is often quoted, lex orandi, lex credendi. The way that we pray is highly formative. It forms the way that we think about God and think about the world in which we are living, God's interaction with that world. So the words that we use are really very, very important.
You will realize, I'm sure, that the introduction of a new translation is not purely a liturgical issue. If anything, it's an issue that very deeply touches our understanding of the nature of the Church. It's about ecclesiology as well. One of the bishops who's speaking there, Archbishop Mark Coleridge, the Archbishop of Canberra, said the liturgy is something we receive. It's a gift to us from the Church. It's part of the tradition, part of that which the Church hands on to us in every generation. I think for many of us, that's something we have to be reminded of, because we've come to understand, in some sense, that the liturgy is something we very much craft for ourselves. And that element in some liturgical celebrations can dominate. It's a matter of achieving a balance between that which we receive and that which we make of the liturgy ourselves. Another important issue for catechesis, another important consideration when we come to plan all of those things which constitute our celebration of the liturgical mystery. We've got 5 minutes or so now until we break after this first session. So I wonder if anybody has any questions or observations or reactions in relation to the material we've looked at so far. So we're concentrating on different ways of translating, the present situation, where we're going, and some of the implications of that. Don't all rush. Thank you.
I do have a specific question. You mentioned that the Greek book was actually produced by 11 bishops themselves.
Well, when I say it's produced by the Commission, so it's bishops who are assisted by technical advisors. There are technical translators involved in every stage of this process. But one of the principles of Liturgiam Authenticam was to basically underline the responsibility of bishops to provide liturgical texts for use in their own territories. ICEL really, in one sense, is a collaboration between a group of bishops' conferences who happen to share the same language. But that responsibility, in its most essential expression, is the responsibility of individual conferences and indeed individual bishops. So really, ICEL now, I think, is ambiguously an agency that assists the bishops in meeting that responsibility.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Were the bishops that involved in previous translations, or were they a little bit more?
The current translation, not to the same extent. The 1973 translation in English, there were a small number of bishops who were involved in that process, but the work was largely done by scholars, priests, religious and lay people. Thank you.
Could you comment on something regarding the dynamics of the new translation and how that's being received by the clergy? Have you come across that in your experience?
Well, I've been to a number of dioceses, not only in this country, but in England and in Australia, New Zealand. I've been to the Diocesan Liturgical Commission of Hong Kong. Initially, I think I'd have to say that there are a lot of urban myths about this translation. People are more informed by what they've read on blogs than they actually are about the facts of the issue. So I've been categorically told by people in some sessions that the process that I've just described to you is not in fact the way the translation is made. Well, some people just can't be persuaded. So I think really in one sense, one of the things that I immediately identified as a challenge when I came to this work, and I still can't entirely answer this question, is why has the process been such a secret? I'll be honest, I couldn't have given you the account I've just given about the process 18 months ago. Why? I think perhaps there has been a failure to make this information available so that people have understood the process as it's unfolded. And that means that we've just got a bigger task at this stage. That's why it's envisaged that there is a year of catechetical preparation, of introduction of the idea of the text before the actual implementation of the text. Many people, the South African bishop who spoke, identified this as a very serious lack last time round. I would say that we've lived with the consequences of that for 40 years. That a lack of care and catechesis, and don't forget it wasn't only the change of a translation, it was a change of the rite of Mass. This is a lesser change. We're not changing the rite. The rite of Mass remains the same. The general instruction on the Roman Missal remains the same. It's a change of translation. But even so, what did Father Faber, the founder of the London Oratory, say? All change is for the worst, even when it's for the best. That's countered, though, by Cardinal Newman, same religious family of the Oratory, who said, to live is to change, to be holy is to have changed often. Any more thoughts before we head to the break? Thank you.
Father, the video mentioned dynamic equivalence and how this still scholar felt that this theory is implied in this use. Could you comment on what that priest's actual theory was and then how it was applied?
Well, his theory, as Monsignor Hobbit explained, was in relation specifically to biblical translation. And it was with the idea of producing a version of the Bible, specifically in English, that had a certain immediacy in its impact, that would be easily grasped by people and would use the language of the present time, but convey something of the intensity of the original. That is, roughly speaking, the basis of dynamic equivalence. As Archbishop Coleridge said, it's wrong to see these two things as opposites. All texts, all good texts, have both features present. They have elements of dynamic equivalence and they have elements of formal equivalence. Formal equivalence means that the structure of the original is somehow appropriately represented in the translation. This will be better for us to see in the next two sessions when we actually look at the text and we can identify for ourselves these elements in the texts. I think we've got time perhaps just for one more before we break. Thank you. There are very, very slight changes, both in terms of those which have been given as updates of the general instruction in the years since 1973, and in some cases there are small changes which are local adaptations which the Congregation for Divine Worship have agreed in relation to local bishops' conferences. Good. So I believe we've got half an hour, is it, to digest some of those ideas and to relax a little. And I look forward to seeing you here promptly to begin our next session at 10:15. Thank you very much.